So a while back, I made a tutorial on making multi-boot CDs and using things like UNetBootin, and I think I showed another way that I can't even remember off the top of my head on how to do that. But since I've been learning more about the boot process and how the system boots and how live CDs work, I've learned a little bit more about manually doing that. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to make a minimal 3 different distribution boot CD manually. So we're in the folder we've been working with, and we're accumulating more and more files as the tutorial's gone. By the way, this is part of a series. There should be an annotation on the screen to the full playlist. But I want to make a multi-boot CD for TinyCore, SLTAS, and the net install of Debian. And both the SLTAS and the TinyCore are going to be the shell versions of them, the smaller, just no GUI interface for them. Although this will work, whatever distribution you have, as long as you copy over the correct files. And if you've been watching this series from the beginning, you know which files those are. So let's get going. I've already created a folder here called multi-boot. There is nothing in that folder right now. It's empty. But that's where we're going to be putting all our files for the creation of this live CD. So what I have to do is one at a time mount these ISOs, extract the kernel and the initial RAM disk for each, and I'm going to put them into that multi-boot. We have our empty ISO folder here, which is where I'm going to mount each distro. So let's start off. We'll say sudo mount, and we'll do TinyCore first. We'll mount that ISO to the ISO folder, and then we will copy from ISO boot the core.gz, which is the initial RAM disk, to our multi-boot folder. We'll do the same for the kernel, which in this case is called VM Linux, and we'll just call that, just to keep things consistent again, it doesn't matter what it's called, we're going to just call that core. So we've copied both those files into our multi-boot folder. We can now unmount the ISO folder, and we can now mount, we'll do SLTAS next. We'll mount the SLTAS ISO to ISO, and this time we'll copy from ISO boot. Again, this one has 4 initial RAM disks. I'm going to go for number 4, which is the basic shell, and we'll copy that to the multi-boot, and we will call it sltas.gz, just so we know which one that is. And then for the kernel, we will just call it SLTAS, so we're being consistent with how we're naming the files, just so we know later on. At this point, we can unmount the ISO folder, and now we will mount the mini ISO, which is the net install ISO for Debian. So basically our multi-boot CD, you'll be able to boot into the shell of SLTAS or TinyCore, install either of those operating systems, or bring up the install process for a net install of Debian. So we'll mount that to ISO, and we will copy from ISO. And this one doesn't have a boot folder, just kind of like the ISO we're going to be making. I'm not putting anything inside folders. You might want to organize it a little bit better. I'm just putting everything in the root directory of the ISO. But in this case, their kernel is called Linux, so we'll copy that, and we'll call it debnet in our multi-boot. And we'll say copy from ISO the initial RAM disk to our multi-boot folder, and we'll call that debnet.gz. We will unmount that ISO folder, and now we will go into our multi-boot folder. We'll list out the files we have, and as you can see, we have 6 files: the kernel for each distribution and the initial RAM disk file system for each of those ISOs. So now one more file we need to put in here, and 2 that we have to create. Well, technically we don't need to create both of them, but we're going to. We are going to, if you remember a previous tutorial, we need to put in the ISO linux.bin file, which you can actually pull out of any one of these distros. Actually, let's do that. Let's go back and let's remount the Debian ISO. So I was going to pull it off. I have it somewhere else on my system. But instead of going and looking for it or going online and downloading it, I will just copy from the ISO folder. Since we're pulling these off anyway, we'll pull off this ISO bin file, and we'll put that into our multi-boot. So you just have to get a hold of that file wherever it is you get a hold of it. Also, you could look at other config files, since we're about to create one, and see how they do it, because we're going to make a very simple one with a message, and then you type what distro you want to go into. But we're going to do that from scratch. But you can, again, look at that. You can have splash screens and other stuff going on as well. But we will unmount that ISO folder. Now we'll go back into our multi-boot folder. So now we have that bootloader bin file in here. So now I'm going to create a boot.msg file. It's just going to be a text file that's going to be the welcome message. So I'm going to say, welcome to my multi-boot CD. Now, I'm not going to have a menu that they can scroll up and down to pick from. It's basically, we can press type 1 and hit enter for SLTAS, 2 for TinyCore, 3 for Debian, or we can tell them to type in certain phrases, which will be, all this will be whatever labels we label them as. But 1, 2, and 3 might be simpler for the end user, but just to show that you can do more than that, we're going to say type SLTAS for SLTAS and press enter. And I'm just going to copy that a few times over, and we'll say type core for TinyCore and press enter, and we'll say type Debian. These will be case sensitive for net install of Debian, and press enter. So that will be our welcome message. Let's just make it look a little nicer. We'll put some stuff around it here, so you can see the title there, and maybe some asterisks here and here, whatever you want it to look like. So we've created that boot message. Now we gotta create our, and by the way, I'm using Vim as my text editor. Use whatever text editor you prefer. I assume that if you're watching this tutorial, you're advanced enough to understand what a text editor is, so I didn't get into that. But we're going to now create and edit an ISO linux.config file, which the first line will say display the file that we just created, whatever we called it, in this case boot.msg. We'll say prompt1, and we will then say timeout. We'll just put 300 in there, and then we'll say default. We'll say SLTAS. Then we'll create a label, and we'll call it SLTAS. And now whatever you call these labels is what the user has to type. So if you wanted them to type 1 for SLTAS, you would label this 1 instead of SLTAS, and then the default would be the same, whichever one you want to be the default. Here we'll say kernel is SLTAS. We don't need to give it any folders because it's all in the same directory as our ISO Linux. Append init RAM disk for SLTAS will be SLTAS.gz. Label, what did we say? We said core for TinyCore. We gotta remember what we typed inside our message. So I know that we're labeling it the same that we had the kernel's label, but the kernel can be called something else. The label is what the user types to load whatever kernel we put here. So append init rd equals core.gz, and we'll do another label. We'll call it Debian, and here's an example. We labeled the kernel for this debnet, and append the initial RAM disk equals debnet.gz. Okay, so if I typed everything right, sorry, I thought I hit an extra key as I was going out there. If I typed everything right, we have these files. Again, our boot message, our config for the bootloader, the binary for the bootloader, and our file systems, and our kernels. So we're going to go back out to this, the folder above that, and now for the big old long XORR ISO file system command, which we used in a previous tutorial. Older tutorials will show you to use make ISO file system program. That is now, I guess, depreciated, and if you're using newer versions of Debian at least, that is no longer what you use. So here we're going to say, so you can see we're back out in our folder here, and this is the folder with all our information, the multi-boot there. So now we're going to say XORR ISO FS space dash L space dash capital J space dash no dash emul dash boot space dash boot dash load dash size 4 dash boot dash info dash table space dash B, and now we tell it where the ISO Linux bin file is going to be. And since we have everything in the root directory of our ISO, it's just going to be ISO linux.bin. Again, all depending on how you organize the CD. If you put that in a folder called boot, it would be boot /ISO linux.bin. Or if you put it in boot ISO Linux and then ISO linux.bin, you would write that out. And then -C, this is going to be a file it's going to create, and we want that in the same folder, so we're just going to call it boot.cat. Then we're going to create our output, which we'll call this multi.iso. And then lastly, the folder that all our files are currently in, which is our multi-boot folder. And if I typed all that correctly and hit enter, successfully completed. Let's test it out. Let's see if it boots. First off, let's list it out, multiboot.iso or multi.iso. You can see that it is 29 megabytes, which is interesting because when I tested this out before, it was only 17 megabytes. Did I add something in there this time different than I did before? Well, let's see if it boots. And maybe that will answer my question. Maybe I did do something wrong. So I'm going to use my QEMU, or however you pronounce it, for the virtual machine CD-ROM multiboot.iso or multi.iso. So here we go. We get our welcome screen, and it says type slitaz for slitaz, core for tiny core, Debian for that. So we're just, by default, if we just hit enter, it's going to default to slitaz because that's what we set the default to. So I can just hit enter for slitaz. I could have wrote that in that little welcome message. But as you can see, it's loaded the kernel, unpackaged the initial RAM disk, and now it is just loading the operating system. And again, in this virtual machine, I think it's going to take somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds for it to boot. Checking for network, okay. Language, slitaz asks, keyboard configuration, and we are booted at 28 seconds. I'll log in as root, and you can see we're now in slitaz. Ta-da! So let's reboot that. And it'll bring us right back. It loads the CD again. All this information up here is just the virtual machine looking for drives that aren't there, just as your hard drive would if you, or your desktop would if your computer didn't have a hard drive. You know, whatever order you have the boot sequence set up as in your on your motherboard in the BIOS or whatever. And so I typed in core because that was our next option, and you can see it went into tiny core. So I can then it found the network. I can do sudo reboot to reboot again. And just like rebooting a real machine, it's going to check all the different drives again. And then I can type in Debian for Debian. And this is the net install disk, so in a moment we'll be greeted with the installer. And there we go. So that has booted properly. So all the images booted properly. Let me abort this installation. Make sure you want to exit. It's going to reboot the computer. I'll just kill QEMU. I'm still a little curious because, like I said, when I did this before, I only had a 17 megabyte file. Let me list multi-boot here. Oh. Did I put something in here different than I did before? Because I made one and I tested it, so I'm just curious as what I did different. I'll look for a second here if I don't figure it out. That's 10 megabytes, that sounds right. It looks like it should only be about, I guess, I don't know how I did that before. Excuse me, and I guess technically we did copy over a different kernel for each one. We probably don't have to do that. I'm just now thinking one kernel should work for all of them as long as there's the same architecture. I guess I would grab whichever is the newest kernel. And as you can see, TinyCore is a little bit bigger, but the Debian and SLTAS ones are the same size, so they're probably compiled fairly similar. So that's actually something I didn't think of before. Probably could have saved ourselves a couple of megabytes by only having one kernel. In fact, you know what? Tutorial might get a little long, but let's go ahead and give that a try. We will cd into multi-boot, and I am going to remove SLTAS, and I'm going to remove core, and I'm going to move the Debian.net to, we'll just call it Linux, and that will be our kernel. We'll go back into our ISO config file, and we will just change each one of these. And once again, I'm assuming this should work. I haven't tried this out, but don't see why it wouldn't, as long as as I said, the compatible kernels. And we will run our command from before. Everything looks good here. Enter. Let's list out the size of it now. Multiboot.iso. 24 megabytes. So from our previous compile, we just saved 5 megabytes. And let's boot it up, see if it loads. I'll hit enter. SLTAS seems to be working, and we're using the Debian kernel from the netboot CD. Unpacking, yeah, oh, yeah, everything seems to be going okay so far. And after this, I'll boot up TinyCore. Don't really have to boot up the Debian since that's the kernel we use. We know it works. Okay. Booted a little bit faster that time. That was nice. Maybe it's because it was a better kernel. Who knows? Reboot. And we'll type in core. Now this one, we'll see. You know, sure seems to be. Yep, might run into a problem there. So, I mean, it was a good test. The Debian kernel worked with SLTAS, but it doesn't seem to work with the TinyCore, which TinyCore was a different size, so it obviously was compiled with some different options in there. But something to keep in mind, if you were to create a multi-boot CD, you could test out different kernels, and especially if you're designing the file systems and you're compiling the kernel for it, you could use one kernel with different options. Anyway, before this tutorial gets way too long, I just want to thank you for watching. I hope you're enjoying this series. There should be an annotation on the screen to the full playlist. Go ahead and check that out. Hopefully you've already watched the previous videos. New video every Monday. So if you're watching the playlist and you get to a point where you can't access any more videos, it's because they haven't been released yet. Next one will be released on Monday. And I have different tutorials on Wednesdays and Fridays on different topics. Be sure to subscribe above so you don't miss these or any of my other videos. Also, if you like these topics, be sure to click the like button so that I know that you liked this topic and you liked this video. And feel free to comment below as well. I love comments, but questions should not be put in the comments. If you have a question, Google's a good place, but if you want to ask me or somebody else, the IRC channel is a good place. If you go to filmsbychris.com, that's Chris with a K, there's a link in the description. There should be a link on that page to my IRC channel. I want to thank you for watching, and I hope that you have a great day.